Hi, this is Cynthia from Creative Cali Stanks, and I'm going to demonstrate to you how I made this card using products from the Stamps of Life. So we begin here. I have die cut everything, and I am using the Stamp Sets candle for birthdays. Actually, I'm not using the stamps, I'm only using the dies. This is an older set that many Stamps of Life fans may have. I'm also using the dies from the Pine Cones to Stamp set, just that small pine cone set. I'm also using the Scalloped Slimline card die set that was recently released. I'm using the card base as well as the solid layering piece. Those are the two portions of that one that I am using. And I am also using the striped alphabet die set that previously was released on HSN. And I'm using the letters to spell out the word Noel. All right, so as we get started here, I am going to take the pieces that I have die cut for the candle flames. I have pre-done that. And realistically, I probably should have done my ink blending prior to doing the die cutting, but I was die cutting everything out at once, so I went ahead and did that. And I keep my sponges that I use for ink blending. I've made a card and I've got one for each color, and so I am going to be using some that I have previously created, and then I've also got a couple that I've used the stamps themselves, but I have not done ink blending with them. And so I have many of these inks. Most of them are by the Stamps of Life, but a handful of them are Colorbox, whom the Stamps of Life used to have manufacture their inks, but they are no longer in business. So I will be using some lemonade ink. I will be using some marigold and a Colorbox ink that is very, very close to the Stamps of Life banana ink. It just wasn't available at the time that I got it, and I already had this lovely ink pad that I'm going to use. And when it dries up, I'm going to get the banana ink because it's very, very similar to it. So I also keep my inks in a Stephanie Buddy bag, and I use the Tim Holtz handles. Rather than buying multiple handles, what I do is I use the one handle and then just change out my sponge dauber there that I'm going to use. And so I'm just tapping on the little candle flames. I realize you can't exactly see them as they are white die cuts on a white paper. But I'm just trying to give them a little bit of coloring to make them look more like an actual candle flame. So there I go. I'm use the lemonade first. Started with the lightest color, and now I'm going to be dabbing on some of this almost banana. I guess it's actually called dandelion. But it looks very, very much like the Stamps of Life banana. And then I'm going to change out my sponge and switch over to the marigold to really make it look a bit more like an actual candle flame. Now, I'm doing this as the first time that I've used this marigold to do some ink blending, so I've had to get a new sponge to put onto my blending tool, which means that it's actually not as smooth of a blend as I would normally like to see. But since it's such a small piece and I'm just doing the edges, it works out okay. If I was doing an actual ink blended background, I would have to do get a lot more ink into that. But it turns out fairly nice, and you can kind of see that it's starting to look like actual candle flames. And then, what I'm going to do is once I clear some space here, is I am going to bring, I love doing those cards, and I've got a sample stamp, and I got a little box that I keep them in. They take up so much less storage space than if I were to just, have separate handles for each color. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in the actual red candles that I have previously die cut. Again, those are the dies that match the candles for birthday stamp set. Now, as I get out these candle die cuts, what I've actually decided to do is I've decided to add some inked edges just to give the candles themselves a little bit of dimension. And this is another one where I needed a new ink pad. I was sure that I had an ink pad for the Stamps of Life Strawberry. This is their the older style ink pads, but it's the same color ink. And so I'm just going around and inking the edges just to give the candles themselves a little bit of dimension so they didn't look quite so flat. I suppose I probably could have gone in and like hand colored with markers and things like this if I wanted to do it, but I was trying to make this a relatively simple card, even though at the same time it's got a lot of die cutting in it. And so I'm just going through and doing all 3 candles and giving a little bit of an edging. And I'm also making sure to get the top edge of the candle where the wick would join the candle itself. I'm not particularly worried about getting any of the red ink on the part that looks like the flame, because that's actually going to be covered by the little flames that I have previously inked up and colored. And then the next step that I'm going to do is I am going to get a marker in order to color the wick itself. If you take a look at a candle that has burned recently, the wick always looks really, really dark. And so to give that impression, rather than die cutting this itty bitty piece, I'm just taking a dark brown marker. You could use a black marker, anything that was really dark, and just coloring the wick portion. And what I'm actually using is I'm just using one of my Copic markers. It is a dark brown. I think it was E49, if you want the actual color that I grabbed. But it just adds that little bit of ending, and yeah, I think that was E49 there, and give it just that little bit of an extra. So then I'm going to take my art glitter glue, which is my sort of favorite all-purpose glue here, and I'm going to start assembling. I'm going to add these flames, being careful to make sure that the flames are going the correct direction. They really are directional. You just kind of got to make sure that you get them on the right way. And add the flame portion to the candle top. Now it does give me a sort of very faint red outline. And if that bothers you, you could trim it off. There may even be a slightly larger die that you could use, or cut one just the top of the candle. But I'm okay with it showing that faint red border around the candle flames. And it's just a matter of attaching the flames here and coming all the way down to the brown portion that I colored on the wick. And I do that for all 3 candles. And then I will also come back in and add a little teeny bit more of the marigold ink on the edges of the candles itself, just as I'm kind of thinking that it just needs a teeny bit more. I don't actually add any more ink. I just use what ink is left in the sponge, just so that it's a little bit darker as it goes into that sort of very, very faint red edge that exists on the little candle flame. And then as soon as I finish that, we will be getting ready to attach those to the card itself. I'm cleaning off my hands a little bit with just a basic baby wipe, since the card base is white, and of course the card itself is a lovely green. I don't want to take a chance of getting any red or sort of an orangish look on, ink splotches on the background there. So what I'm doing is I'm positioning these three to kind of look a little bit like a candelabra, like you might see at Christmas time, and just deciding which one I think looks the nicest in the middle, and I'm going to put the two on the edges a little bit lower. And they are intentionally hanging off the sides like that. I'm actually going to trim them down. And so then once I've kind of happy with my basic arrangement, I am going to come in here and decide where I want them. Of course, at the last minute I decide, you know what, the background looks a little too flat. So I'm going to pull out my spearmint ink, also from the Stamps of Life. This actually isn't spearmint paper. This is just paper that I happen to have in my stash, and I'm really not sure what color it is. And to be perfectly honest, I don't even think it's by the Stamps of Life. But I am going to sort of add in this ink blended edge just to give it a little bit of depth and dimension. And I kind of surprised myself that I did not have a sponge for this one, so I had to go get another one out of my drawer and attach that to my handle. And then I'm going to take, first I just hold it in the air and begin inking the edges, which looks pretty good, and gives it the very, very edges just that little bit of a dimension. And then I decide that, you know what, I want a little bit more than just the very, very edge. So I'm going to do a little bit more of an true ink blend, and just kind of go from off the edge onto and a little bit deeper into the background layer here itself. And so I just grabbed my scratch paper that I had used for the candle flames and am going sort of over the edges here. Again, this one is using a brand new sponge, and those don't always work quite as good, so I had to use a little bit more ink in places that I normally would have. And one way I kind of do that is I go sort of back and forth between adding the ink on the edges and adding, kind of moving in towards the center, just to sort of smooth out any areas where you might see the edges of the sponge. And then what I also often do, just to kind of, I guess, preserve some of the ink, is I'll tap it off inside the lid, and rather than tapping it off onto the paper, just so that I can go back and then pull a little bit more from the inside of that lid. I think it creates a little bit smoother of a blend, especially when you're starting with a kind of a brand new sponge. And I just go until I'm relatively happy with it. And then now I'm going to be positioning those candles. And I've actually sped up this section just because I'm going to be doing some trimming, and you probably don't really need to watch me cutting all that much. But first, I'm going to glue down these three candles in the position that I like. And the center one is going to be a little bit taller than the other two, just to kind of mimic like a holiday table centerpiece that you might see, or I don't know if you'd actually want to call it a candelabra, but you know how you get those pretty centerpieces from the florists that have the greenery and everything else. And so they do hang off the edge. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with a pair of scissors, and I snip it. It's sort of a quick snip, and then I go in and kind of trim the edges a little bit more, clean it up just a bit. I don't worry about it being absolutely perfect because most of this edge is going to be covered, and you're not going to see the the smoothness, I guess. If that bothers you, you could always take and put your layer back into your die cut machine and just carefully line up the layer itself and trim that way. But you can see it looks fairly good. And then once you start adding in these pine cone or pine fronds, it hides it really, really well. And I purposely did not do double-sided adhesive on the back of these because I wanted these pine fronds to kind of lift up a little bit. And so I'm just dabbing a little tiny bit of glue there on the center stem and tapping it in place. I'm going to use 4 of them kind of pointed outward so that it kind of creates that sort of centerpiece effect, and place it, testing it where it overlaps here on my card. You can see they hang down just a smidge on the edge. And then I decide I want a 5th one, but it's too long, so I just trim off a little bit of a section there, and I do the same thing. I just add some little dabs of glue and sort of press that into the middle, and you can see it really hides that edge very, very well. And so then the final thing that I'm going to do, after, of course, I put the pin back in the glue bottle there, is I'm going to take my dies, and the double-sided adhesive on these means that the letter itself is still kind of stuck in the die, and I'm going to use that to my advantage so that I don't distort any of the letters, especially the O. That's the one I fear I would distort the most. So I'm laying down the dies kind of where I think I want them, and just, kind of shifting them around a little bit, and it allows for me to do that. And then I'm just poking my, I guess you would call it a little pokey tool, into the corners where I know it's the letter itself. And a few of the sort of striped cutouts for this particular alphabet set do get stuck in, but I just use the tip of that piercing tool to lift them out. Since I haven't really pressed down on the letter, everything is just barely holding on, and I'm going to wait until I clear all of those out in order to do that. Now, it is possible that it might have been easier to pull the letters out of the die itself, but since I had individual letters, I find this is a little bit easier for me to line everything up, where I can kind of shift the dies around, and then finally I just, once I'm happy with where they're all at, just burnish lightly and then put it on the card base here. And so I just take a little bit of the glue and put it on there. I got a faint little clog here. It sometimes happens. I left the pin out a little bit too long. This is particularly the case when you're dealing with the very, very fine tip, but once it flows really, really nicely. And then I just place my layer onto the background and press to finish. And so there is now my finished Christmas card. And here's the close-up where you can see the shading and all the die cutting. And so thanks for joining me. And if you'd like, please subscribe to my channel. And thanks for watching.